This next panel is titled Voight-Kampff tests, which is, I don't know if you've heard of a film. I didn't mean for the first two panels to both be named after be catchphrases from movies that recently had mediocre reboots, but here we are. So in Blade Runner, perhaps you've seen it, the Voight-Kampff test is the test administered to determine whether or not someone is or is not a replicant. And had a very mean thing to say about Blade Runner, but maybe I'll hold back for now. I know, fighting words. But ultimately, that is a movie about a society that uses arbitrary metrics to determine who is and is not human, and then allows the police to murder them. That was my mean thing to say about Blade Runner, but it's actually just factually correct. And this is a set of talks that are in many ways addressing this question of who gets to decide. What is the kind of framing around which one's humanity is valued or not valued? And I'm so thrilled to have Ruha Benjamin, who was a participant at last year's conference and is just someone who I'm so grateful to have had pass into my life. Ruha is an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University and the author of People Science, Bodies on the Rights of the Stem Cell Frontier, and editor of Captivating Technology, Race, Carceral Technoscience, and Liberatory Imagination in Everyday Life.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you for all the organizers. This is a special gathering for those who came last year and this year, and so much of it has to do with the thought and the care that goes into every aspect. Even the parts where you feel are loosey-goosey, they've been designed into the system, and I appreciate that, so thank you so much. So I'm trained as a sociologist, and one of the recent studies that came out that got me thinking more and more about the importance of narrative and the theoretical significance of imagination comes out of Stanford. And what they did was they surveyed people in the Bay Area and in New York and showed them data of the racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And then they asked them, after they were exposed to those racial disparities, whether they were willing to support reforms for changing the 3 strikes law in California and stop and frisk in New York. And what they found was that the more exposure they had to the data, the less likely they were to support the reforms. And so they began, as the researchers themselves and as I began to process this, it becomes clear that the stories we tell about data and with data really matter, that there's no straightforward link between more data and greater consciousness and awareness and social change. And so I think this should inspire us to invest as much in the stories as we do in the data and thinking about their connection. And so I sort of summarize that sentiment, the way that hit me, as the facts alone will not save us. As the rebellion following the murder of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri was underway in the summer of 2015, with numerous images and videos of the uprising circulating online, there was one particular image that captured my imagination. It showed a wall with the words, "Ferguson is the future," spray painted on the side. A future, I wondered, of militarized police who terrorize residents using technologies of war and technologies of finance, or a future of courageous citizens who demand justice and dignity using technologies of communication. The uncertainty, I think, is what we make of it. In the midst of this social crisis, where even the most basic assertion that Black Lives Matter is contested, we're drowning in data of inequality and injustice, whether it's a new study on criminal justice disparities or another video of police brutality. Demanding empirical evidence of systematic wrongdoing can have a kind of perverse quality, as if subjugated people must petition again and again and again for admission into the category human, for which empathy is rationed and applications are routinely denied. In such a context, novel fictions that reimagine and rework all that is taken for granted about the current structure of the social world, alternatives to capitalism, racism, and patriarchy are urgently needed. Fictions in this sense are not falsehoods, but refashionings through which analysts experiment with different scenarios, trajectories, and reversals, elaborating new values and testing different possibilities for creating more just and equitable societies. Such fictions are not meant to convince others of what is, but to expand our own visions of what is possible. This is not to say that imagining alternatives is sufficient or that all things possible are even desirable. But how will we know if we don't routinely push the boundaries of our own thinking, which include the stories we tell about the social world? In the words of historian Robin D.G. Kelley, we must tap the well of our own collective imaginations that we do what earlier generations have done, dream. Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. Building upon this insight, the following narrative sketch is an experiment to know things differently, a way to reflect anew about the themes of my research, and ultimately to explore the relationship between racial fictions and biological facts. So here's the context, and I'm going to skip around a little bit in the story you have in front of you. The year is 2064. A reparations initiative that allows victims of police brutality to regenerate organs is well underway. A major new component of the initiative is about to be unveiled for the 50th anniversary of the Ferguson uprising, but the largest biobank in the country has been repeatedly hit by raiders intent on selling stem cells on the white market. Ayanna and her team have to find a way to secure the cell depository and revitalize the movement. So, of course, I'm inspired by Octavia Butler. Your people will change. Your young people will be more like us and ours more like you. Your hierarchical tendencies will be modified. And if we learn to regenerate limbs and reshape our bodies, we'll share these abilities with you. That's part of the trade. We're overdue for it. There it was again, lights, hammer, action. Just as the lightning was about to strike, Ayanna wrestled herself awake. Chest pounding and sweat circling her neck, she struggled to make out what happened. Footsteps overhead, channels flipping, smothered voices, and lightning, always lightning, headed directly towards her forehead. The Humanities Plus counselor kept telling her not to worry. Chronic dreams are perfectly normal, a symptom from the previous life. They'll fade with time. But it's been 10 years, and they had only become more vivid. Lights, camera, action. Ayanna heard it clearly this time. A film crew was shooting her while she slept. That made no sense, unless, of course, entertainment executives had started mining people's inner lives, piped dreams, because reality had become so unbearably stale. Gossip, fight, screw, shop, backstab on endless repeat. No doubt they would plunder the dreams of 17-year-old girls like her to create a newfangled surreality shows. Stuffing her head under the pillow to avoid the crawl of sunlight across the room, Ayanna's thoughts continued to drift. For all their high-tech gadgets, why hadn't the Humanities Plus engineers created a better antidote for these leftover lives? How hard could it be to develop some kind of neural vacuum to suck up all these memory crumbs? After all, there must be side effects to almost getting struck by lightning night after night. But maybe that was the point. Just then, the bank alarm vibrated across Ayanna's wrist, a third break-in attempt this month. She sat up, dizzy, and hooked into her chair so fast that she knocked the stack of regeneration event flyers off her nightstand. Whoever said time heals never had a tumor growing inside their belly, mistaken for a child. As many times as she read it, it was no less disturbing. Why devise such a morbid slogan for the occasion, one meant to inspire? Dead babies, for God's sake. The People's Science Council really needed a better PR team. What hope, delusion, or mix of both would lead anyone to ignore the lack of movement? Annoyed, Ayanna tapped her wrist to check on the rest of her team while she rushed out of the door. The only other people moving around Grand Ave so early on a Saturday were the market vendors who were vying for the best spots to make it easier to unload. She could already smell the curry potatoes simmering at the roti stand, torture when she couldn't stop for some. Soon drummers from all over the Bay would make their way over for what seemed like hours and hours of conversation without words. If she had more time, Ayanna would stop by Ishel's coffee stand, but in the distance she could see the first burst of orange and fuchsia over Lake Merritt. She pressed the accelerate option on her chair, sped past all the pedestrians confined to their legs, over the water through downtown Oakland, and over the Oscar Grant Memorial Bridge until she reached the SF Bio District. It never got old. How commuters glanced at her with that mix of envy and amazement. "Oakland's very own Shuri," exclaimed the Wakanda-inspired headline. Do you think she would be used to it by now? As usual, Ayanna arrived first at the bank. She circled the perimeter a few times, ensuring all the cryotanks were secure, and collected footage from the bank's eye. As she made her way towards the atrium, she glanced out one of the floor-to-ceiling windows that extended the length of the hallway and saw that the wall near the highway exit was tagged. It was one of those illicit ads popping up all around the Bay. "Are you a victim of reverse regeneration? Get exactly what you deserve on the white market. 2-for-1 special. Livers, kidneys, hearts, grown to order." More like mass-produced using pig and cow parts, she thought. Raiders, it seemed, were becoming more and more relentless as the 50th regeneration grew closer, trying to capitalize on the excitement and anxiety surrounding the Ferguson anniversary. How long until they figured out that stem cells were not the only living things being kept alive in the banks? So I'm skipping a conversation that she has with her team members, Tamir, Rice, Rakia Boyd, and Freddie Gray. As Ayanna ran through a checklist of the security matrix, considering all the possible ways it could be hacked, Director Lax rushed into the atrium, breathless. How could this have happened again? Ayanna reassured her that everything had been reinforced. None of the cryotanks had been touched. All of the tissue had been accounted for, including the air cell lines needed for tomorrow's revival ceremony. On her way back home, taking shortcuts through SF Bio District, across the Oscar Grant Memorial Bridge and over Lake Merritt, she noticed the purple sunset reflecting on the water. Another restless night to come, memory crumbs scraping the inside of her head, forcing her awake. Wake up, wake up, wake up! To mark the 50th anniversary of the Ferguson uprising, the People's Science Council was working around the clock to revive one Mr. Eric Garner, the father of 6 who was choked to death by the NYPD officers in 2014. Holding him in cryosleep until all the necessary procedures could be honed, the council was confident that Garner could be resuscitated without incident. Ayanna wasn't so sure. She hinted as much to Director Lax, who appeared unwavering. Had the Garner family even been consulted? 6 grandchildren and a few great-grands, all conspicuously silent about what the council had planned. Lax, of all people, should care about keeping kin in the know. Lo and behold, soon after Ayanna raised the question, there was a press conference, smiling relatives, congenial scientists, and a bronze bust of the soon-to-awake Garner, a scholarship fund, and heart-wrenching interviews with family members who seemed genuinely excited. Still, Ayanna was uneasy. Garner's last words, "I can't breathe," had served as a clarion call for 5 decades of movement building. So it seemed fitting that he would be revived for the anniversary, assuming, of course, that the multiple transplants worked. A lot could go wrong: infections, graft failure, cancers. If successful, he would be the first adult to successfully undergo doubling, resuscitation, and organ renewal. Only children had survived up until that point, and even then, not without complication. Ayanna Monet Stanley Jones, killed by a Detroit SWAT team in 2010, was the only person who had survived doubling without debilitating side effects. But she was a child at the time, 7 years old, when an officer threw a flash grenade where she lay sleeping on her grandmother's couch. A reality TV crew was shooting the raid as officers shot Ayanna in the head. When the council woke Ayanna up from cryosleep in 2054 and implanted a new heart, lungs, and spine, at first there was only minor graft rejection, which transplant specialists were able to control. But as she went through pure puberty, then came the seizures, blackouts, and hallucinations, usually involving nocturnal lightning strikes. Being born again was more like purgatory than heaven on earth. With a grant from the Humanities Plus Foundation, Ayanna's transplant team designed the first of its kind, Chairperson TM, an apparatus that not only maintains internal homeostasis, so she no longer experienced the original side effects, it also included augmentations, like the ability to hover up to 40 miles an hour on land or water, and acute sensitivity to electrical fields, which enhanced her ability to communicate, orient to her surroundings, track things, and protect herself. What Ayanna considered its coolest feature was that the chair grew as she did. Humanities Plus engineers harnessed the elastic properties of melanin with a new 3D printing method that took synthetic biology to a whole new level. Not only did chairperson TM run on solar energy, given its melanin substructure, but it literally never gets old, which is why Ayanna's closest friend, Sandra, loved to tease, I guess it's true what they say, cyborg blacks don't crack. Still, Ayanna's life after doubling had been challenging, even with the gold standard in Second Life starter kits. Mr. Garner, by contrast, was not only an adult, but the first to require multiple regenerated organs, a half-century after his first life was stolen. Waking up would be just the beginning. Ayanna was gliding up the ramp of the People Science building on Mission Street when she heard someone calling her name. "Hey, Madam Chairperson, wait up, Miss Jones, wait up." It was Sandra. "How long you think this meeting is gonna take?" "Not more than an hour, I hope. The revival organizers have to finish setting up, so they shouldn't keep us long." "Well, as soon as it's over, there's something I need to tell you," whispered Sandra. As Ayanna and Sandra walked in the glass front doors, the welcome hologram seemed louder than usual, the history of the council and its achievements on blast. The Reparations Initiative, now in its 10th year, covers the cost of regenerative medicine for victims of police brutality. Scientists honed a technique in which they take mature human cells from a patient and reprogram it to create any other tissue in the body. And because the regenerated tissue is produced from the person's own cells, they avoid complications that arise with donors. Over 10,000 people have undergone this suite of procedures, and nearly all survived. As she and Sandra walked through the exhibition halls, waiting for the meeting to begin, Ayanna couldn't help think about when news first broke about the reprogramming technique. Millions of families actually started banking their own skin cells, a kind of insurance policy. That was before the Reparations Initiative led to the official disbanding of police. This was the era of every 6 hours, children playing cops and robbers shot down on playgrounds, teenagers goofing off with toy guns left bleeding in department store aisles, mentally ill adults treated with multiple shots to the head, mowed down for walking, driving, breathing out of place, phones, wallets, and other objects allegedly mistaken for weapons, not to mention all the residual damage, the chronic stress of living under siege. Every public school teacher assigned a police escort, classmates terrified, pretending not to notice, kids as young as 6 with chronic hypertension. The council headquarters devoted an entire floor to the history of decarceration, a holographic exhibit with vintage footage from police body cams, smartphones, and TV crews played nonstop. As Ayanna and Sandra passed the glass cases that displayed Amadou Diallo's wallet, Stephen Clark's cell phone, and numerous other objects supposedly mistaken for weapons, Ayanna looked on with disgust. It always troubled her, not just a section presenting her own murder, but the whole idea of playing and replaying Black Death, the pornography of genocide on constant loop. Why, in fact, do we need to see to believe? The building's voiceover continued. When police were forced to wear body cameras in 2015, the non-indictments flowed even more freely. They were, after all, responding as they'd been trained. It was never meant to be a fair fight. Non-lethal force isn't in our repertoire. To indict individual officers would be to admit that the entire apparatus was defective. The council dubbed victims of police violence as AIs, as in attached incidents, their way of countering the fictional notion that these were isolated acts. Eventually, the staggering number of AIs created a boon for the biobanking sector, whereas anyone who could afford it could get a transplant. Only certified AIs were completely covered under the Reparations Act of 2035. Slowly replacing the college fund common in the early part of the century, parents and grandparents now open tissue accounts for their loved ones. The hologram replaced images of the People's Science Council at the signing of the Reparations Act with the old billboards that ran over the highway. Don't sell your family short. Bank with us today. And although most of the transplant procedures were far too expensive for the average person, monthly payment plans were manageable for most families. Sandra and Ayanna found their way back to the main atrium just as a public service announcement began. Your ancestors fueled the new world economy, just as mitochondria power the cellular body. Harness your history, transform the biopolity. Come in for a free consultation to see if middle passage mitochondria is right for you. Why was it taking so long for council members to come out for the meeting? Sandra, usually overflowing with news from the weekend, just kept looking intently in the direction of the welcome hologram. Ayanna barely noticed that she was inching closer and closer until their elbows touched. I can't wait anymore. There's something I have to tell you, Ayanna. What is it? You know the 6th floor, Sandra asked. You mean the floor they've been renovating since Malia Obama was president? Ayanna said with a smirk. What about it? Well, it doesn't need renovating. Sandra lowered her voice even more. That's the Raiders' office. Uh-huh, Ayanna snickered, expecting Sandra to embellish this tall tale and thankful for the entertainment while they waited. But Sandra wasn't smiling, and the look in her eye caused Ayanna's spine to tighten. What are you saying, Sandra? She asked intently. I'm saying, she paused, a group of elementary school students visiting the Decarceration Museum shuffled past. I'm saying that the raiders, who you've been chasing for 3 years, work for the council, or more precisely, the council created the raiders. But why? Asked Ayanna, curious but defensive. Distraction, replied Sandra. Distraction from what? Probed Ayanna. Her nagging itch, which had always told her there was more going on than Director Lax had let on, turned into a sensory rash. The nodes connecting her spine and chair pulsed so hard she could feel her lungs expand and blood rushing into her extremities. So listen, the revival is tomorrow, and you only have one chance to get this right. Get what right? Ayanna asked. Think about it, Ayanna. When did you first hear about the raiders? It was the week of the elections, and it didn't look like the Reparations Act was going to pass. Don't you think it's odd how these biobank attacks are always one step ahead? And notice how they always seem to follow the death of a transplant survivor, or at least the public ones that people get asking where these free procedures for police brutality are really what they're made out to be. What are you saying, Sandra? Distraction. The raiders are manufactured distraction. There's no white market. There's only the People's Science Council honing these techniques on the backs of police brutality victims for free. Once they sort out all the kinks involved in bringing people back to life, doubling will require a stringent screening process given overpopulation. They'll abandon the free treatments, and the People's Science Council will give way to the immortocracy. What's the immortocracy? Ayanna asked impatiently. An elite class that aims to never die, immortals, or so they hope. They have everything life has to offer, except the pesky problem of death keeps getting in the way. But so far, the procedures have been too risky. They needed a long-term plan to hone them. Hence the Reparations Act, a cover for what they really have planned. Stunned, Ayanna asked, and how am I supposed to stop this? Ayanna, unless you can get a message to Mr. Garner before the curtain falls on the elaborate charade those faux populists at the People's Science headquarters win. Their success relies on Garner's successful doubling, and as long as he plays his part, parroting the script they've given him, a celebrity spokesman for their immortality products, the revival will usher in a new caste system. He stood on the stage, clapping, turning to a hum, as Dr. Lax began her introduction. Eric twisted in his suit ever so slightly, the lining loose in places, bunching in others. Rushed, he thought. Everything was rushed. Death, life, and now this three-piece suit. Not even his style. But the grandkid seemed so excited that he couldn't say no. So there he stood, with an inner lining, doing what it wanted. Trying to ignore the discomfort, he glanced once more at the script his handler had in practice. Special thanks to the People's Science Council for organizing this incredible revival, the mayor of San Francisco, Brisenia Flores, the director of the Trayvon Martin Biobank, Dr. Henrietta Lacks, and all the sponsors, Biomed, Biohead, Biolum, Biolung. Just then, a thunderous applause erupted in the Giants Google Stadium. He was up. Mr. Garner smiled and waved, just as his handler had reminded, took a sip of water, and stared down at the script, his new heart beating loudly. Murdered by the hands of police, born again by the hands of scientists, he thought, both without asking. Off script, he began. Who will pay reparations on my soul? Thank you for your attention.
A talk by Melissa Gira Grant and Danielle Blunt. Melissa is a journalist, author, and senior staff reporter at The Appeal. And her most recent book, Playing the Whore, The Work of Sex Work, has been translated into 6 languages. Danielle Blunt is an NYC-based dominatrix, currently studying at CUNY SPH and working with survivors against SESTA. She enjoys watching her community thrive and making men cry.
You wake up one morning to find your Google Drive and your website have been deleted. There is no warning, no explanation. You try to tweet about it, but no one replies. Your hashtags and your username aren't appearing in searches. Your clients post payments, but your credit card processor vanishes before the funds land in your account. The only payment processor that you have access to takes a 50% cut. You try to log into Instagram, but your account has been disabled. Your clients can't reach you, and the ones that can are taking advantage of the precarity of your situation. You work in an industry that can be isolating as is, and now your phone number, your emails, and your websites, all of the channels that you use to connect and to do your work and to build community are disappearing. How do you work? How do you make your voice heard? How do you participate in a community on social media that is actively being silenced and erased? What does security look like if the resources that you're trying to secure are disappearing without a warning or without a trace? This is not a fictional dystopian future. For sex workers, this is a reality, and it's been happening.
Online platforms, the power and the incentive to censor their users for fear of, quote unquote, facilitating sex work. Now, what does that mean? For the first time, SESTA and FOSTA makes platforms themselves liable for the content that users post to them if that content can be construed as facilitating prostitution. Why does a law that's meant to combat human trafficking target all prostitution? SESTA FOSTA does this by gutting Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which until this April was regarded as the law that protected internet freedom. This is Amy Schumer in a PSA, probably the only PSA ever made concerning the CDA 230 that wasn't produced by EFF. Most people don't know what this law is. And we don't need to talk about it in depth right now. We're actually going to skip over some of the nitty-gritty of the law. And that's because, like most laws, the most important thing this law does isn't actually contained in the text of the law itself. What SESTA and FOSTA has done is to change our environment, the political environment, the online environment, and the environment in which sex workers work and organize and live. Because SESTA FOSTA has also galvanized sex workers who are showing up in the streets despite the risk of these laws. Even those who are fearful to communicate online, fears only magnified with this law's passage, are organizing in greater numbers offline. As a community that's at risk of being disappeared online, sex workers are taking up and demanding public space in a new way.
Sex workers losing access to space to work and to exist is not something that is new. Websites have been taken down, users have been censored, and ad sites have been raided by the FBI for a while. This law doesn't just affect sex worker ads and community platforms, but any platform that a sex worker might use, such as all social media, and even we're still waiting to see a dating site response as well. The platform response following SESTA FOSTA being signed into law was swift and it was brutal. Craigslist, who had long been a target of the anti-sex worker groups who actually backed SESTA and FOSTA, responded immediately and put up this notice here and removed their personal ads section where a lot of sex worker ads had sort of migrated after the adult ads section was shut down in 2010. Craigslist's reasoning was that any tool or service can be misused, and in this case, that would mean that anyone who could use Craigslist to violate the law, and now Craigslist could be held responsible. Within hours, Reddit had sent messages to the moderators of the sex worker subreddit informing them of a content policy update and that they would need to change their community rules to stay in accordance. And this type of transparency is actually pretty rare in the responses that we've seen from other platforms. These are just 2 examples of swift responses to SESTA and FOSTA. This is a list from Survivors Against SESTA that we've been documenting of even more tools that sex workers use to organize, to screen clients, to stay in touch with each other, and to advertise their services and get work that have been taken down. While we're unsure what exactly is a response to SESTA and FOSTA from social media platforms, as things like real name policies, algorithms outing sex workers, and shadow banning have been happening for a really long time, and long before this was signed into law, things seem to be happening at a significantly faster rate. Here are a few things that we've seen post-FOSTA being signed into law. So this is a slide where a performer, Andre Shakti, was helping sources for a journalist and got a 30-day ban from Facebook for violating community standards. This is the banning of Instagram hashtags. We're not entirely sure what it is. There's a lack of transparency, but it seems to be a mix of a glitch in auto-moderation, user reporting of posts, and a really good example of a platform mimicking the misogyny of their users, as we see the traditionally femme counterparts to the banned or the shadow banned hashtags not being blocked. So we've seen the hashtag curvy, hashtag stripper, hashtag sex worker rights not showing up in searches. So it's set, if you go back, it says that these are currently hidden because the community has reported some content that may not meet Instagram's community guidelines. Sex workers are reporting that Twitter without explanation doesn't display their tweets in searches. In some instances, usernames don't even show up in searches unless you're already following this person. Whether or not we're following the terms of service, we're subject to shadow banning. And sex workers who are shadow banned receive around 1/10 of the interactions with tweets and often rely on community boosting and retweeting so that their content's getting seen, so that when they're traveling or posting ads, that they're able to get work. And despite being advertised as a bill that was necessary to take down Backpage and being sort of like touted as like a benefit of SESTA and FOSTA, the FBI seized Backpage before SESTA and FOSTA was signed into law due to a prosecution that began way before SESTA and FOSTA was even proposed. We're living in a society that is regimentally silencing marginalized voices. Platforms are encouraged to contribute to this silencing through erasing our existence from the internet. There's tremendous fear in the community as we try to comply with and work around rules that aren't always apparent to us, and rules that are often enforced differently for different people. Workers have hosted self-censorship parties where they get together and delete potentially problematic content while drinking heavily that they think might get them banned from the platforms. People are losing access to work and are unable to support themselves and their families. Homelessness, suicide, and an uptick in contact from abusive clients and pimps are a few very visible effects of SESTA-FOSTA.
So how did this happen? The reason that you likely haven't spoken about this a lot, how many people in this room had heard of FOSTA or SESTA before today? It's probably something about Ingrid's friends. But if I could ask this question of the live stream, it's probably many people. One of the reasons that people aren't talking about this has everything to do with the reason it passed Congress so overwhelmingly, right? If you're going to market anything as combating trafficking, who is going to stand up against that? Maybe very particularly principled people like Barbara Lee might stand up against that, but even then it wasn't enough to stop this bill. Presented as these bills were under the guise of stopping human trafficking, very few people dug into them to ask, why is it necessary to target all prostitution on the internet? And just so you know, using these platforms right now, before FOSTA was passed into law and to this moment, if you're using the internet to facilitate prostitution, that could still be criminalized. But what this does is it puts the penalties for that on the platforms themselves. And that's the very dangerous thing. It basically says to platforms, do the policing that the police have always been doing. And at the same time as this lands in Congress, right, social media platforms are also facing a lot of scrutiny for their apparent or actual role in the 2016 election. People can't stop talking about fake news, dragging Mark Zuckerberg to sing for his supper and defend himself. And some of the Washington sources that I have believe that SESTA and FOSTA was actually kind of a bone that was thrown by Congress. Bone thrown to Congress by the tech companies. They had originally opposed it under the rubric of the Internet Association, but most of them pulled back off of it, and some of them, including Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, like actually actively lobbied for this bill. So the bone that was thrown to Congress by tech simultaneously threw sex workers under the bus. At the same time, the supporters of SESTA and FOSTA have been gaslighting sex workers. And an op-ed at The Hill that ran just in the last week, some of the lawyers behind the bill said that sex workers who were documenting the harms they were already experiencing, groups like Survivors Against SESTA, who've gotten tremendous amount of media coverage for this part of it, it's my responsibility, but many other people gave them coverage. They referred to sex workers' concerns for their health and safety as fake news. So this is great. What does fake news even mean anymore in this context? So users, including sex workers, are contending with a lot of laws that are supposed to improve the internet and make these platforms more transparent in how they act with us. Looking at GDPR, right, and the flood of sort of terms of service change notifications that we've all been getting, when those notifications started arriving in sex worker community, some people thought that those were terms of service updates that were as a result of SESTA FOSTA, and it created a tremendous amount of fear. It also inspired people to go back through the terms of service of other platforms that they were already using, and they started discovering anti-sex work clauses in there as well. But some of those were things that had been there for years. And so this has created a lot of fear, but also kind of a mass awakening of how the internet is actually constructed if you're a sex worker. So the only tech kind of advocacy group to really oppose SESTA and FOSTA explicitly as a violation of sex workers' rights was the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And they had been involved in activism and advocacy around CDA 230 for a long time, and this in a way was just an extension of that. But when the law passed, it's not like tech companies sort of followed their analysis. One of the more egregious examples of their disregard for sex workers came after the creation of a Mastodon instance called Twitter. It was a way to sort of like migrate sex work Twitter into a platform that people thought, because of the way that Mastodon works, that maybe it would be safer when it came to platform censorship. But that didn't protect Twitter from the call that Cloudflare, their content distribution network, made when they denied them service. And Cloudflare's general counsel said, confirming that this decision to violate sex work, or to deny sex worker service, was due to FOSTA. They said they thought FOSTA was, quote, a very bad law and a very dangerous precedent. They did it anyway. You might remember the last time Cloudflare did this in a very public way was with white supremacists. Cloudflare's CEO said it took him months after learning what the Daily Stormer was, a white supremacist website. Even after the murder of Heather Heyer in Charlottesville, it took him months to decide to deny service to the Daily Stormer. It took them days after Twitter. For sex workers who are the ones facing the increased risk of violence as a result of this law, they're the ones being silenced and erased. What's significant also is people in technology rights, but also technology research, institutions like this one, people who have access, those who aren't getting censored in the same way that sex workers are, the people who have power and resources, have not been speaking out. The people who are speaking out, who are taking risks, are the people who are the most likely to be censored. And one reason for this, I think, is because CDA 230 is complicated. SESTA, FOSTA themselves were very complicated bills. Was seen as sort of a complicated technology thing, but it wasn't a technology thing, right? Like every technology issue, this was a social justice and a human rights issue. And like always, a lot of people missed that. And they also missed that in this case because the people whose rights were being violated were sex workers.
So I'm going to take a second and pass this around. You guys can take a look, and we'll get back to it in a moment. So the point of the law wasn't to write a law that people could obey, but to shame and to scare people into performing a certain behavior or not performing that behavior. And this is how prostitution law already functions. Not everybody who engages in prostitution gets policed the same way, and the law certainly doesn't stop prostitution.
For example, police disproportionately arrest people of color and trans folks, and again, acknowledging those aren't disparate groups, for prostitution-related offenses as sometimes part of tactics, these kind of clean up the streets campaigns, quality of life policing, all of those rubrics. And in New York City, they do this using a law called loitering for the purposes of prostitution. This is a state law that's only been on the books since the 70s. And in effect, it criminalizes people for being in an area, quote unquote, known for prostitution. All that means is police frequently arrest people in that area. What this does is it criminalizes people for being who they are and where they are, being a trans woman in public, being a black woman in public. These are forms that the NYPD officers submit after such arrests. Once they target someone for arrest based on who they are and where they are, police will describe that person's otherwise lawful dress and speech and conduct as the reason for their arrest. You can leave it up. Now we're seeing this dynamic play out online. For example, the first ad sites that went down after SESTA FOSTA were sites predominantly used by trans folks, folks of color, and low-income folks. Many sex workers found greater autonomy through access to online work. They were able to advertise independently, some for the first time, to screen clients better, to build community. It could be a pathway out of forms of sex work that expose them to more violence and more policing. And the reason that there is sort of an internet economy for sex work isn't just have to do with the internet, it's because street policing has pushed people online. And now with legislation such as SESTA and FOSTA, that policing is being done by the platforms. The fear and the self-censorship that sex workers are facing right now has become community policing itself.
And so while you all take a look at what we're passing around, I'm going to walk you through an example from public health of how the law and how the law is policed are two entirely different things and differ depending on who you are and where you are. For example, carrying condoms in New York is not a crime, yet police may claim condoms they find on a person as evidence of prostitution. Despite carrying condoms not being a crime, when condoms were actively being used by police as evidence for prostitution and loitering-based offenses, many street-based workers would refuse condoms from harm reduction health outreach teams for fear of arrest. And I want to emphasize that community members were put in the position where they had to decide to not carry condoms, a harm reduction tool, in order to avoid what they deemed as a greater harm, getting arrested. Fear, isolation, and stigma reduce access to safer working conditions. And what we are seeing now post-FOSTA and SESTA is the loss of harm reduction tools that we use as a community to stay safe. An already isolated community is being pushed further into the shadows as we are being forced to weigh the pros and cons of safer working practices and being able to provide for ourselves and for our families. And so have people gotten a chance to take a look at this? Because I'm gonna try and do it with a mic and Thank you. So what we've been passing around is a tool used that reduces the chances you'll be arrested if the police are using condoms as evidence. It's a little black box. It obfuscates what's inside, and it reduces the chances that when the cops are going through your bag that they're gonna find condoms. So what you'll see inside of it is lube on one side in this portable thing, and then the other side has condoms and places for pills like birth control or pep and prep. And you can also almost open it without breaking a nail, which is a nifty, a nifty part of that as well. And choosing to carry this is a form of harm reduction, which may reduce an individual's chances of being arrested, and it might make them feel more empowered and able to carry condoms with them while they're working. Thank you. Similar to what we're seeing online post-SESTA and FOSTA, people are being forced to police actions that are not necessarily illegal, but are criminalized depending on who you are and what spaces you're occupying. So how is this harm reduction?
This little guy. I mean, it's cheap, right, for people putting it together, and it's free for the people who need it the most.
And it's something that sort of already exists, and it's being distributed to people that are most heavily policed by a pre-existing distribution method.
It's also a conversation starter, perhaps it was in this room. It's a little unintimidating, little egg-like thing, but it's a solution that points to something that's very scary and a lot harder to combat, which is the law.
It's also fucking ridiculous that it's necessary, but it's also really helpful for people. And also, it's free. So under SESTA FOSTA, what is our little black box? And how do we make it accessible to the people who are most impacted by this law?
What are some of the accessible technologies that we already have that can be made accessible in this moment to sex workers? And isn't actually a difficult question to answer. And as we were talking about this, I started going back to sort of how we got here in the first place, which is the invention of Craigslist erotic services, insofar as you could call that an invention. All that Craigslist did is they just gave a category to these ads. They gave them a place to go, right? This wasn't like some great visionary statement by Craig Newmark or Jim Buckmaster about politics or economics or believing sex work was work. It was a design choice. It was a way to organize content, and by extension, it's a way to organize users, people. It was a means to an end. To put something somewhere so it has a place of its own, so it doesn't end up everywhere else. And that isn't really the logic of rights and justice. It's actually the same logic of segregation that led to the formation of red light districts in the US in the late 19th century. They actually aren't that old, you guys. Red light districts have only really existed for about 100 years. All of this is an innovation only insofar as it takes this kind of Gilded Age urban planning idea of the red light district and applies it to a website. And that website is still just made of black text and little blue links.
And due to the environment of SESTA FOSTA, in many cases, people are fearful of sharing resources due to being surveilled by the police.
We saw this happen after the Department of Justice raided Rentboy website about 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, where apparent undercover police came to a harm reduction event that advertisers on Rentboy held to sort of talk about like what happens now. And undercover police had also been visiting community events organized by Rentboy to gather evidence against them, as documented in their federal indictment, which has a lot of material about lube and slings and stuff in there if you ever want to check that out.
We've also had challenges in considering how to best share this information, afraid that if we publicly draw attention to the ways that people are surviving under this legislation, are we shining a light on those resources and increasing the chances that they'll be taken away?
If anything, prior to this moment, sex workers online have mostly been reduced to pieces of content to be moved around, not people who have needs for privacy and rights and justice. So to really survive under SESTA and FOSTA, we're going to have to dismantle that as well.
If sex workers are the most likely to be policed and surveilled, the most likely to have their privacy violated online, most likely to be harassed and suspended from platforms, if we create a platform that is safe for sex workers, we've probably created a platform that's safe for most communities. On June 2nd, for International Whores Day, we had more than 500 workers and accomplices march from Stonewall to Washington Square Park to take up public space, to demand an end of the criminalization of sex work and police and state violence. While our community is actively being silenced, we decided that rather than ending our action with a moment of silence, we wanted to end with a moment of rage. And so we all turned around and faced outwards so that everyone else could hear us, because we all hear each other. And we fucking screamed for a minute, and it was amazing. We want to be heard, and we ask you to listen to us to shift resources and skills to the folks who are most harmed by poorly designed legislation and technology.
And as a journalist, I want to know that I can communicate safely with sex workers without causing them harm through exposure. With Blunt, we're planning a day-long event where we hope technologists will first listen to community members about how they're impacted by SESTA and FOSTA. And only after that can they brainstorm together what kinds of solutions that sex workers might need and others who are impacted by these laws to share resources and relevant skills, but led by the expertise of the people who are dealing with this. One of the greatest needs in the community right now is just demystifying how the internet and the law intersect, as well as understanding the power that internet platforms have over all of our speech and rights.
The erasure of sex workers from the internet through discriminatory legislation such as SESTA and FOSTA is just the beginning of policies that will work to censor the internet for everyone. SESTA FOSTA fundamentally altered the architecture and the landscape of the internet by making platforms legally liable for the content posted by their users. In this case, that's content regarding sex work. This legislation has created a very dangerous precedent that chips away at all of our digital rights. A radical shift in power is necessary to fight this harmful law, and we believe that begins with resource sharing and extending safe harbor to the people most impacted by FOSTA and SESTA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Blunt. Weird. Craig Newmark's philanthropy is more than ready to give money to fake news initiatives. including this institution. I didn't say that. Our final speaker is Jennifer Hamilton, who is an associate professor of legal studies and anthropology at Hampshire College and director of the Five College Women's Studies Research Center. She is the author of Indigeneity in the Courtroom, Law, Culture, and the Production of Difference in North American Courts, and is currently completing a second book manuscript, The Indian in the Freezer, Settler Genomics and the Quest for Indigeneity. Do you want?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, can you? That'd be great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm so grateful to be here and to be in conversation with all of you. Thank you, Ruha. And so what I'm going to present today is actually an offshoot of the book project that I'm working on called The Return of the Plastic Indian. And so I want to begin by saying it's customary in Native studies to acknowledge the peoples indigenous to the lands on which we're gathered here today. In this case, the Lenape of Manhattan, which is now, of course, known as Lower Manhattan. And so I want to simultaneously acknowledge that our capacity to be here today is premised on longstanding dispossession of land and of water, but also to insist on linking this acknowledgement to the larger questions of the conference, namely the politics of temporality and the potential of speculation to think futures otherwise. So as I mentioned, this work is an offshoot of my current book project, The Indian in the Freezer, Settler Genomics and the Quest for Indigeneity. So The Indian in the Freezer, just very briefly, brings settler colonial critique and indigenous studies into conversation with histories of empire through an investigation of how indigeneity is framed in genomics and the associated life sciences. I'm particularly interested in bioinformatic Indians, for example. So The Indian in the Freezer is a play on the title of the 1980s young adult novel, The Indian in the Cupboard, which some of you may have read. And in that novel, a white British boy uses magic to bring to life a plastic toy Indian named Little Bear. The central argument of my book is that the same settler colonial desires and imaginaries that literally animate the character of Little Bear and the Indian in the Cupboard and the subsequent books in the series, including The Return of the Indian, are mirrored in the contemporary genomic sciences, especially in those projects seeking to find lost Indians using genomic technologies, including things I think of particular interest to this group in terms of how algorithms are being applied to bioinformatic data to produce particular kinds of understandings of that data and what it means for health, origins, and human wellness. So The Indian in the Freezer demonstrates how contemporary population genetics is undergirded by a quest for indigeneity, a quest that is made possible both by the structures of settler colonialism and the material conditions of biocapital, which I think Ruha really beautifully outlined for us in terms of how to think about those things. So using the figure of Little Bear, the larger piece of which this is part, puts a brief history of plastics, the originary material condition of the Indian in the Cupboard, into conversation with the history of the Onondaga Nation, focusing especially on their unsuccessful land claim litigation against New York State and 5 corporate defendants. So in the book, Little Bear is identified as, quote unquote, an Iroquois brave, part of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy. In the film version of The Indian in the Cupboard, the character of Little Bear is Onondaga, one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So Little Bear originally comes from the 18th century, the time of the French and Indian War, before he is transported into the late 20th century New York City. Something of the magic itself is that Little Bear not only travels through time, but also through space. In other words, he does not travel 200 years into the future and land in the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or 6 nations and meet his descendants, who, despite settler expectations to the contrary, have survived. So the question of how and why Little Bear in his space-time travels ends up in the 1980s UK with Omri in the novel, or in New York with Omri in the film, rather than in another future, such as with his descendants in the 20th century or 21st century Onondaga Nation, is a curious one. And I argue that this is an example of what Mark Rifkin calls settler time. Right? So the temporal trick whereby Indians are edited out of the current moment or cast as inherently anachronistic emerges out of the refusal to accept the geopolitical implications of persistent indigenous becoming, the ways in which the presentness of indigenous peoples challenges settler claims to possession now and for the future. So the larger piece of which this is part reimagines the story of the Indian in the cupboard and its sequel, The Return of the Indian. And the way that I'm trying to retell the story is that Little Bear travels into the 21st century to join his living descendants as they live and thrive and grapple with ongoing legacies of colonization, environmental degradation, and other post-industrial aftermaths. So the plastic Indian is a much maligned, but nevertheless omnipresent object. And it is similarly part of a larger technoscientific story, that of the manufacture of plastics. So as the lobby group for the American Chemical Council has long claimed, plastics make it possible. And in this work is in part a meditation on the it and the possible. Objects like plastic Indians allow us to index conflicts over natural resources, over water and territory, as well as to excavate the long-term health effects of dispossession and industrialization, especially in terms of how such things converge in indigenous communities across Native North America and indeed across the world. So in a 2012 article for the Indian Country Media Network, Akwesasne Mohawk journalist and author Vincent Schilling describes how over the course of 1 week, he decided to, quote, pay very close attention to the stimulus that entered my brain regarding the definition of an American Indian person. Schilling describes being overwhelmed by the number of times he encountered a stereotypical representation, including on his trip to a local thrift store. Quote, in the first glass case sat a large plastic Indian chief next to Mickey Mouse and Santa Claus, and a few aisles over was a cheap dream catcher in a plastic bag with a 99-cent tag. This encounter with a large plastic Indian chief has the air of the inevitable. This is hardly surprising given the sheer number of plastic Indian figurines manufactured in the 20th and 21st centuries. So while I cannot locate any precise number of plastic Indians manufactured in any given year, let alone over the 80-plus years that I'm talking about, it does not seem unreasonable to estimate the number in the millions, the hundreds of millions, and in fact probably in the billions. I draw this figure from the fact that approximately 1 billion Star Wars action figures have been sold since the late 1970s. The Netflix program, The Toys That Made Us, estimates that if all these were melted down, they could make a Chewbacca figure that would extend beyond the height of the Empire State Building. The same program claims around 4 billion Lego minifigures has been manufactured since then. So as the character Mr. Plastic in this cartoon by Oglala Lakota artist Marty Tubles reminds us, somewhere on this earth, every piece of plastic ever made is still here in some landfill or floating on our seas. Of course, the mere ubiquity and durability of plastics cannot explain why they have so often, stubbornly even, taken the form of the Indian. Mass-produced toys are themselves products of the Industrial Revolution. For instance, some of the earliest Indian figures were made of lead. And as archaeologists Christopher Barton and Kyle Somerville demonstrate, toys produced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were didactic objects for children and reflected deep cultural preoccupations with gender, race, and class. The material culture of racialized toys and environmental degradation are closely linked, both in terms of their material manifestations and in their afterlives. Of course, we know that the impacts of plastic and other toxic substances are not born equally, and that one of the ironies, one of the ongoing effects of settler time is the organization of a contemporary landscape that makes some places more livable than others, that histories of dispossession, reservations, and segregation are embodied differently. So Onondaga Lake, to come back to this slide, is located just north and west of modern-day Syracuse and is one of the most polluted lakes in the United States. So along its shores, the lake has been home to various multinational corporations since the 19th century, including Allied Chemicals and its successor company, Honeywell, and thus has borne witness to the Industrial Revolution and its post-industrial aftermaths, including the aftermaths of plastics manufacturers. So just to reiterate this point, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that Onondaga Lake, which forms the center of the contemporary Onondaga Reservation, is itself one of the most polluted places in the United States, one of the most polluted bodies of water in the United States. This is where Little Bear, if he were to follow my travel, my space-time warp, would end up back here. So Onondaga Lake was declared a Superfund site in 1994, 200 years after the signing of the Treaty of Canandaigua, promising peace and friendship between the United States and the Six Nations. The lake is also part of the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, specifically Onondaga Nation, which is a federally recognized tribe with approximately 1,500 current members. So the Onondaga Nation, like many other nations in the United States and in my home of Canada, also claims traditional territory that extend far beyond the boundaries of contemporary reserves and reservations and would include some of the land we're on right now. So the Onondaga Nation was involved in a decade-long litigation in U.S. courts, attempting to have the federal government recognize its sovereign status and recognize its own treaty obligations, including hunting and fishing rights. Ultimately, the case was dismissed by the United States Supreme Court in 2013, and the Onondaga Nation brought its land claim into the realm of international law by appealing to the United Nations, and this litigation is still ongoing. So, to shift gears. In her introduction to the edited volume, Walking the Clouds, an anthology of Indigenous science fiction, Grace Dillon asks whether or not science fiction has the capacity to envision Native futures, Indigenous hopes, and dreams recovered by rethinking the past in a new framework. In the process of doing this work, I began to speculate about the enfleshment of plastic, the plasticization of flesh, the afterlives of plastic toys, and their deep links to historic and ongoing settler colonial formations on land and in the water. In particular, I began to imagine what would happen if all of the plastic Indians, in all of their bits and pieces, all of their microplastic formations existing in the world, suddenly, like Little Bear and the Indian in the cupboard, came to life. So that somewhere, in one of the great garbage patches in the Pacific Ocean, plastic molecules started to recombine, to reform into their pseudo-originary states, to recombine into the figures of the plastic Indians manufactured across time and space. They begin to remold in a boiling sea, in a too-hot ocean. Homunculi begin to swim to the surface, to breathe Earth's atmosphere, to emerge on land. I'm going to interrupt the story. So I want to interrupt the narrative to think about some really important things, particularly about where plastic Indians are throughout the earth. From where would they come? What would they do? The bottom line is that I don't know. And this is not my story to tell. It's important to remember that the molded plastic figures are themselves based on particular anthropological and popular cultural representations. And these imaginaries are rooted in a conceit that a plastic Indian could and would be easily re-enfleshed into something recognizable, legible, and into an embodied person with a cognizable history, one told through settler stories. So it's helpful at this point to return to the very story that opened this discussion, the story of the Indian in the cupboard. And again, I'm turning now to Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson's work in a book called Mohawk Interruptus, where she really challenges the ways in which ethnographic storytelling has contributed to ideas of Indigenous erasure and disappearance today. And so Simpson asks how to stop a story that is always being told, or how to change a story that is always being told. In part, it will be to remember and respect that peoples who have long been relegated to the past might be particularly interested in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we're definitely pushing time, but that was a lot. Like that, I just want to acknowledge that you all did, this was a ton, and I'm really, really grateful to have had you all speaking. This is audience decision-making time. Do we want to have a shorter break in time for conversation now, or do we want to have this time, the 30-minute break time to have conversations that are just not part of like a public Q&A? Is there a preference? Shorter break? All right, we're into that? All right, then I'm gonna ask our esteemed panelists and get another chair to return. Does anybody want to have a question, comment, want to start us off?
Hi. So, Ruha, you opened with the fact that many of us have probably encountered at one point or another that in many cases, more information, more data causes people to retreat from justice. And what's so shocking about that is that I don't think anybody thinks that that would happen to them, right? That I've heard this statistic many times, and I'm totally feel so sure that, but if somebody were to tell me the truth, that I would change my mind. And so my question for all of you, good luck with this one, is what do we do about that, right? Because we know that this is true, but it's very difficult to even believe it of yourself, let alone of the audiences that you're trying to reach and communicate with. And so it feels like we still keep going back to, but if you only knew, if I could only tell you the truth, then you would change your mind.
It's an ongoing tough question. I'll just tell you in terms of how I approach it, how I think about it pedagogically, which is, the context is very particular. It's not like everyday conversation, public discourse. There's power dynamics. You have to listen to me. You have to take notes. So I acknowledge that. But, you know, I'm of the Freire school of teachers where I don't assume that whoever I'm talking to, whether in a teaching role or in a, just a conversation, is a blank slate, an empty vessel, right, that I'm pouring data into them or information into them. So I think the starting point has to be this idea of mutuality where you're bringing stories to the data. And that's really what we learned from that study I referenced, to interpret it. And so really trying to make explicit what the interpretive frames are that people are using to approach data, and understanding the data is already, they're contextualizing it whether we want to appreciate that or not. And we need to become much more explicit about it and not simply work to dismantle their stories in a patronizing way. I know the better story for this data, but really listen to where and why those stories resonate and are so powerful for people in terms of what they're bringing to it. The study I refer to, the Stanford study, they have like 3 go-to things that are guidelines for researchers when they're presenting data. And a lot of it has to do with contextualizing, thinking about the institutional context of these disparities, because they're really thinking about how racial disparities, data on racial disparities, they're not circulating in the way we think they are, because we're not actually investing enough in terms of honing our own stories about the data, right? And so I think a lot of this is kind of 101, not banking, a sort of banking approach to education and conversation, thinking about, as Freire would say, problem posing. What are the things you're bringing to the conversation, to the data? So thinking about how to maybe And in some contexts, you might want to formalize that, and some you want to actually, in our everyday practices of listening to each other. We spend so much time in terms of science communication. What about listening as the corollary to thinking about how all of these ideas are going down? So these are just some preliminary reflections to your question.
I'll share a somewhat optimistic story, which is that sex work is being reported on completely differently than it has in the past after the passing of SESTA and FOSTA. And as it was beginning to get pushed through, we're seeing headlines with the word sex work rather than prostitute, which is something that we've never really seen before. We're seeing photos being used of us protesting and resisting rather than just images of fishnets and people getting arrested by police cars. And I think that just lifting up the voices of people who aren't heard is a way to sort of work with that and making sure that they're heard.
I'm not going to throw cold water on that, but I'm kind of going to a little bit. I think one of the problems I face, particularly in the reporting that I do, is there's so much solid evidence that criminalization produces violence and harm, right? We're not even just around sex work, if we're talking around drugs, if we're talking about societies that criminalize same-sex sex, being trans. But conveying that data against this powerful story, that sort of like matrix scare story, like trafficking on the internet, scary bad men, that's where the conflict comes in. And it's really hard to bridge that gap where people are saying, but I just want to protect children. And so that's one ongoing challenge. Even though we have survivors of trafficking, including people who are trafficked as minors, saying this law actually doesn't address the context around my trafficking, it doesn't provide me with justice, even their stories don't matter in the light of this political apparatus. The other thing is, and we talked about this a bit, and I think everybody did, in the sense of sort of like, why should we have to argue for our humanity? Like, why is that the entry point into this conversation? And I think what's actually going on is there's like a great symmetry between this idea that even if we have evidence that criminalization harms people and exposes them to violence, we're still going to support criminalization. And that's not actually contradictory if you believe that it's useful to have laws that expose people to harm if you don't value the humanity of those people, right? So there's actually like, it takes a lot more work to dismantle that, more than data.
Maybe the one thing I would like to point out is, and one of the things that I'm thinking about is that if we, follow the work of, American studies and cultural theorists who've made that argument, I think really quite compellingly, that so much of our scientific production, and that I would include production of statistics about the very things that you all are talking about, are themselves speculative exercises, right? That so much of them is speculation, and then additionally, when confronted with data produced on their own terms, right, in their own logos, is not accepted, right? There's something else going on there in terms of, right, how we might think about and intervene in these. And so for me, this is part of the appeal of a conference like this one and a set of questions like this one, is really, how can we make that speculative dimension work for us in a different kind of way? And that would be the larger question I would pose.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. I really enjoyed them. This question is for Melissa and Danielle. And I was wondering, because you got at kind of some of the momentum that was built in the wake of the presidency and concerns about the role of the internet in that. And I'm also thinking about how increasingly people are publicly making demands around content management regarding harassment of women, regarding harassment of a range of people who, like racial groups and different stuff, right, who are being targeted for harassment and so forth. And also thinking about the Me Too moment and the momentum around that. And so how do sometimes some of these political demands that might come from a place of justice regarding content, regarding harassment and so forth, do they ever collide with some of the ways that people are able to then kind of mobilize concerns around violence against women or misogyny, and the way that a lot of these anti-sex worker campaigns use that concern, right? Like they'll use the concern that people are being trafficked or violated and so forth, and these are real concerns, but they sometimes use kind of a concern around gender justice and are able to mobilize kind of support for these criminalizing measures. And I was wondering if you could talk to that at all, please.
That's a whole book, Tama, that I hope to get to write. I'm remembering, this is probably 2 or 3 years ago now, that the UN endeavored to do something about cyber harassment, or however they nomenclatured that. And some of the recommendations that came out of that, even though they interviewed people who had really deep roots in sort of what this online harassment fight has been going back for several years now, some of the recommendations included things that felt very culture wars throwback, you know, like we have to go after violent video games and we have to go over pornography, and also sex trafficking that got thrown in because I guess that's like the new gloss on some of that stuff. And it's like the paradigm around rights has become a paradigm of criminalization, right? Like I remember talking about digital rights through the framework of open societies, free expression, maximizing people's participation in public life. And I feel like we've rushed to, you know, well, how do we hold people responsible? And it has much less to do with like, well, what are we foreclosing? Like, what are we losing? Like what I find so valuable about Me Too, but something that's also getting lost so quickly, is it's become a conversation about injury and a conversation about violation. And in my own life, and also in the lives of many people that I've talked to who've been targeted by sexual harassment at work, in the media specifically, it's not always a profound violation of your body or your sexuality or yourself. It's a violation of your time. It's a violation of your work. And so I feel like it's so hard in so many areas to disentangle these things. Like, what is accountability without punishment? What is ensuring people's access to rights and justice without locking people up? Right? I mean, I kind of can't resolve any of this without going into an abolitionist framework. And it's really hard because, I mean, look at the Judge Persky recall just a couple of days ago, right, where we were told the sort of feminist solution to the 6-month sentence that was given to Brock Turner was to recall the judge who made that sentence. And there was very compelling argument saying, actually, this is just going to open the door for further punishment that's going to fall on the backs of people who are already over-criminalized in this system. So that's what I think about when I think about that. It's like, it's just huge, and it just takes me back to abolitionism as a practice.
Yeah, and I have 2 anecdotes to share, and hopefully I'll remember both of them. One is that when I was really actively and vocally on Twitter opposing FOSTA and SESTA, I actually, after it got signed into law, was getting targeted ads from End Demand and abolitionist-based organizations who were funding or like pushing the law through. Abolitionism. Oh, okay, yes.
Not that abolitionism.
Yeah. Prohibition-based sex worker organizations who don't believe that sex work should exist, who are the ones heavily pushing the law through. And they were like targeting ads in my timeline because I was using the hashtag like Stop SESTA and things like that, or maybe SESTA. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but it was ridiculous and it felt really mean. I didn't want to see that. And then my other story is about the sex worker inclusion in the Me Too movement, which there are actually a couple of interesting pieces on, and we've had interesting conversations within the community of how to share our stories of violence, which don't necessarily happen while we're working, without sort of like playing out trauma porn for the people who are going to use that as evidence as to why our work should be criminalized and how they're saving us. So I think those competing needs of how we're sharing our stories is something that's come up a lot in community.
One quick thing just on abolitionism, because I don't know if everyone heard that. So, you know, there's prison abolitionism, right? And then there's this group of people who, some of them, the supporters of SESTA and FOSTA, identify their anti-sex work politics and their approach of criminalization as abolitionism, and they're co-opting it, and you'll see them use images of Frederick Douglass and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and like sort of like, look, like this is part of this legacy of liberation, but it's a liberation that relies on locking people up and policing people. So it says something about how powerful that language is, that they're trying to steal it.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions. 1 more question.
So this question is for Ruha. Your story was really powerful, and I was interested in hearing a bit more about how you came to write it in terms of, obviously this is an issue you're very familiar with and it's based on your research, but how do you go about translating that to a narrative, especially given the context of what we're talking about with data not always bringing results?
Thank you for that question. So it was fall of 2015 when I was invited to a workshop that was framed around histories of the future. So it was a group of historians, and I was supposed to write a typical academic essay for it, but I just couldn't. Like, mentally and emotionally, there was too much happening in the world that I just couldn't translate into that sterile prose of academies for this workshop. And so I asked them, can I write a story for the workshop? So a much earlier version of this started out there, and I've been revising and revising. And a big part of the process is to shed the need to feel like a good writer. I don't think I'm a good writer, but I don't care. I don't think it's a good story. I'm not like proud of it as a work of art, but I have to, this is my process. Like, I have to have this way of expressing a different dimension to what I'm thinking about. And so part of it is just like putting messy stuff out there and iterations of it, and not really caring how it's judged as a work of art. Because for me, it's doing something else for me, and for, I hope, other people who are reading it, just to think about their own work. Like, I don't care if you judge it, but maybe you can have a different orientation to your own work. And I'm thinking about it as experimenting with imagination. And when you experiment, you are ready to make mistakes and sort of, do things wrong and get, and learn. It's, this kind of process, as opposed to holding it back until you feel that it's ready for prime time or whatever. And so that's part of the process. Another big piece of it after that Histories of the Future workshop was a symposium that I co-organized with two friends and colleagues, Moya Bailey and Ayanna Jameson, and it was called Ferguson is the Future. That's what we named the symposium after. The image became the story. And we brought together a lot of the people who were on the front lines in Ferguson in conversation with academics and artists, a lot of speculative artists working with visual and stories and all kinds of things into a symposium. And so there's a website that is called blacktothefuture.princeton.edu that you can find all the video of that symposium, which I would really recommend. We had a lot of the core kind of Black sci-fi community there. You get to hear from them. A lot of filmmakers and, Alondra Nelson and Dorothy Roberts keynoted. And so that was another stepping stone that I didn't share any of the story there, but my working on the story sort of took life in this convening. And then, now this version that you're seeing that I adapted for the work we're here. So it's like just growing, it's coming to life slowly, like this theme of regeneration and afterlives and so on. And so it's really the product of being a frustrated academic. Yeah, that's mostly what it is.
Does anyone have one more question? Can I ask a question? I was just wondering, I started watching Westworld again with a lot of resistance. But for Ruha and Jennifer, I wonder if you have seen the show, what your response to it is, because it kind of combines both of your theses for your presentations into this one show, which is very pop right now. I wonder what you think about it.
So I was hoping to manage to sort of pass among all of you as a kind of sci-fi nerd, which I am not. I had to look up Voight-Kampff, and it's so funny, my partner is watching right now. And he is watching Westworld, so that's why I know Westworld, is because he's telling me every time he watches it what it's about. He's also seen Blade Runner like 50 times, so fortunately I have a consulting source. And I have to confess this, I like the idea of science fiction sometimes a lot more than I actually like the science fiction. And I find this like embarrassing, and I think it makes me seem, like far less linear than I would like to be. That said, I've started to read, so for example, I'm listening to Midnight Robber right now by Nalo Hopkinson, which is just out of this world, fantastic. And so I appreciate the question because it reminds me that I need to more deeply engage with these popular cultural things. And I think part of it is that by the time I get around to watching these things, I don't want to think anymore. I want to break. And so, I watched Project Runway, which does not provoke the same kind of response.
They know how to work with plastic on Project Runway, so you can work that into your...
There's this show on Netflix, about toys, like how toys came to, I forget what it's called, but how toys came to be, and I've become completely obsessed with that show because of this.
Yeah, I've watched the first few episodes of Westworld, and it's kind of like on my list of things that I want to just do like a marathon viewing of. But it's one of those shows that I just have to really be in the mood for because it's heavy for me. I don't know. But I think it's interesting, both that and shows like Humans and a few other ones where there's this, we're in a moment where there's anxiety and concern and fascination with our relationship with AI and, all kinds of things that are playing out in media. And so, I think I don't have anything really incisive to say about the show yet because I need to do the marathon. Yeah, maybe you can give us a primer.
During the break, I'm fine.
So another thank you to our fantastic panelists.